Hey, LPVO facts here. Honestly, after I bought the Delta Striker, I kind of made a promise to myself that I'm going to kind of back off on LPVO reviews. But in typical brass facts fashion, after I made that promise, the first thing I did, buy a 1 to 10x LPVO. There is nothing exciting about this 1 to 10x LPVO, which means it breaks both of my rules. It's a 1 to 10x. There's nothing exciting about it. It's been done a lot at this point. So why am I reviewing this thing? Well, I'm actually reviewing this thing because this thing exists. The PLXC is exactly what I'd want to review. It is a market trendsetter. Typically before this point, first focal plane 1 to 8x scopes didn't really have good 1x's, and they tended to be grossly expensive, and a lot of times they weighed a lot. This bucks every single one of those. It is short, it is lightweight, it's only about $1,400, which is pretty cheap for this category, or right on the money depending on where you consider it, and it has one of the best, if not the best 1x's on the market right now in the first focal plane category. This is a big deal. Unfortunately, I've already reviewed this, so I can't review it again. But in that vein, a brand new optics from Primary Arms in the first focal plane category, roughly 1 to 8x, with a very similar reticle, well, okay, now you have my interest. So I bought one. Running this thing for about 2 months now, and I was about to make the review, and then then I got sidetracked. I bought one of these things, not the Hellion. That's not this review. That's next review probably, or I don't know. I don't pay attention to the order of my reviews. But I bought this thing on top here. As you can see, you probably can't see. They look identical. It's an LPVO, right? But this is the 1 to 10x SLx from Primary Arms. 1 to 10 GLX, 1 to 10 SLx. And for those that don't know, Primary Arms kind of categorizes their scopes because they're not just a budget company, they're not just a mid-tier company, but they do some low-end premium scopes, like that PLXC. So SLX, silver, GLX, gold, and PLX, platinum, right? I'm sure that you understand how precious metals work, right?
So it's not just a double feature, but an interesting case study on how Primary Arms views their GLX and SLX line in the modern day. I'll throw in the PLXC at the end just to really round out the comparison so we can see all of them. The first thing that stands out with these new scopes is the notable price hike over previous generations. The SLX, the once very cheap scope, is now costing about $500, the same amount as a previous generation GLX LPVO. And the 1 to 10x GLX now costs almost $1,000, a price point that is encroaching on many other premium scopes in the market. I think it's tempting to view this as inflation and its consequences, or maybe Primary Arms getting a little too frisky, but I think the price bump is a good thing. While in practice, the SLX, GLX, PLX dichotomy is meant to be a somewhat linear quality to performance relationship, I typically find the SLX line, with the exception of the 1 to 6x Nova, ends up being too cheap for its own good. And for just a couple $100 more, the GLX version of whatever scope line takes the cake for not just being a better scope, because you're spending more, but also being a lot better bang for buck, having a noticeable uptick in performance. With this price hike, I think perhaps maybe we're seeing a shift back towards trying to bring the SLX into the bang for buck category. The SLX actually comes with almost no features, while the GLX comes cram-packed with features like auto-live, steel-on-steel turrets, and a higher quality housing. Honestly though, at least for me, while these are nice add-ons, most of this stuff is really just there to make the box look extra impressive with a bunch of stuff on the side. Auto-live in practice doesn't really matter when you have a battery life measured in hours, and steel turrets are inconsequential on an LPVO with capped turrets. So while more expensive scopes should be nicer, the real meat of the upgrade is going to come down to the fact that the GLX is a first focal plane design and probably has better glass. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. This video is sponsored by Venture Surplus, your, I'd like to hope, #1 source for surplus needs. Today Venture Surplus would like me to point you towards the Whoopee hoodie. Simply the fact that it rhymes alone is already a pretty good reason to buy it, but it's a pretty inexpensively priced hoodie style thing in the style of the venerable Whoopee. This Whoopee hoodie is going to be on discount during the release of this specific video, and you can also double dip by using my discount code that I have down in the description below. No, I don't get kickbacks, all the savings are going to you. So thank you Venture Surplus for this one, and back to the video. Both scopes come with oddly named MIL and BDC options. I'm a big fan of BDC for LPVOs, it makes sense, but here, since these are going to generally be used as long-range oriented LPVOs, I think the precision of mills over the speed of BDC makes a lot more sense. So that's what I went with. But really though, different strokes for different folks. Either of them works. Follow your dreams. While both of these scopes have copy-pasted reticles of each other, the first focal plane versus the second focal plane dynamic means they're going to play out vastly different in practice, despite being, the same. I said that, right? At max magnification, these are functionally very similar to previous generations, though tastefully trimmed to be a lot less Star Wars X-Wing crosshair-like. Overall, still a bit busy, but much better than it once was, while still retaining numerous auto-ranging features throughout. As we drop in magnification, nothing changes for the second focal plane scope because, well, that's how optical design works. But if we switch over to the first focal plane reticle, we see, once again, tasteful trimming of fat and a slight redesign over the previous PA reticles. The horseshoe has been shrunk just enough to appear as a large dot on the 1X instead of a horseshoe bracket that we had previously. Personally, I preferred that a lot more. We also have a second larger ring that is actually the correct size to be used for, bracketing from CQB out to 25 yards. This is in contrast to other brands that also have an outer ring for what I imagine is nothing more than brand recognition and point-blank shooting. The only downside is now the ring is kind of just always there, creeping, just outside of your visual center, and it will stay within your visual horizon all the way up to the 9X. This technically doesn't matter at all, but in practice I know this will drive some of you up the wall, you OCD fucks. Regardless, I like it. It's a refined version of the last generation, which was bloated, but overall really good. Okay, that's the reticle. How about the glass? The SLx is actually throwing around some decent weight. It looks fairly clear, and the downrange image is crisp. Not too long ago, I found SLx scopes were basically unusable at the longer distances, looking like the inside of an abandoned 12-year-old fish tank. That's not to say the SLx is perfect, not at all. It has noticeably less light transmission and has a sort of haze over the image, darkened with the colors being kind of like a shade off. The GLX addresses much of this, with some chromatic aberration, but really only if you push your head to the extremes of the eye box. There is a hair more clarity as well, and the colors look much more cleaner and true to life. The hazing effect is mostly gone, and at the end of the day, this actually reminds me a lot of how ED glass tends to look at about the 6 to 8x mark. In a big surprise, I honestly could not tell a significant difference between the GLX 1 to 10x and the PLX-C 1 to 8x. At the 8x. Maybe the PLX-C has a higher resolution looking thing, but really, it might also just be placebo. Quick disclaimer, for the 5 of you not bathroom break maxing at your work and are able to watch this on an actual computer monitor, these two images I just showed you are basically identical. And that's because cameras suck at picking up nuance that makes the difference between a $2,000 scope and a $500 one. The little nuances is what makes or breaks your ability to see ultra small targets, but you can't actually see that nuance on camera. And these two scopes that I'm comparing here today are actually much closer than even that. So consider them B-roll, but don't really take these images home to the bank unless you go on a channel that has the magic touch, like, say, Sea-Doos. Both aren't perfectly matched focally. That is, if you focus the diopter to the 1X, which you generally should, you're not going to get the cleanest image at the 10X and vice versa. It's much more closer than it used to be. Back in the day, you couldn't actually hot swap between them. Here, you can mostly deal with it. But because this is mostly a long-range scope, I think a lot of people are going to focus it at the max magnification and live with it. Or, just put a Sharpie on each extreme marks, and then you can go, back and forth, whatever. So, for some reason, I somehow gaslit myself into thinking that both of these scopes were 34mm, but then on the 1 to 10x GLX, a lot of times I was just running that scope on the 8x because I thought it just looked a lot better and I was having less issues with it. Turns out the GLX for some reason is a 30mm tube, 24mm objective, and the SLX is 34mm tube, 28mm objective. That means the cheaper version here actually has a significantly better eye box. The thing with exit pupil is it not only makes the scope difficult to use because you have a much more constrained place where you can put your eyeball, but also if you're slightly off of the eye box, you find that the image actually tends to dim or darken as you don't get 100% of the light into the pupil. That 4mm does actually make a significant difference. Tell that to your wife. Or don't. I mean, most of you probably don't have wives. Unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and roses for the 1 to 10x SLX. Second focal plane optics only provide accurate drop at max magnification. The reticle doesn't change in size, it actually grows and shrinks relative to the target. With 1 to 4x and 1 to 6x LPVOs, I think this is basically irrelevant. We really only begin to care about the reticle subtensions when we begin to pass about 300 yards. Unfortunately, for something like a 1 to 10x second focal plane scope, we can very much find ourselves shooting at an extended range shot, but we don't want to use all of that 10x for a number of reasons. We've already mentioned exopupil, but how about just simply being too much damn magnification, especially in a target transition type environment? With the 1 to 10x second focal plane LPVO here, we don't have a choice. You need to be at the 10x to have functional subtensions. Since these are LPVOs and this is a brass facts video, we gotta talk about 1x. Unfortunately, I was kind of hoping for PLXC 1x performance here, but nope. We get our stereotypical lukewarm 1 to 10x performance here. It's not great. The GLX does have a near true 1x, but it only applies to a smaller area in the center position. The rest of the scope is warping at the 1x to create a bug fisheye effect. The SLx does have a very nice and flat image, as most second focal plane scopes do, but it's not a true 1x, meaning somewhat like a 1.1x or whatever. Both of these failures matter greatly. Maybe not on a well-lit range where it'll work just fine, but as soon as it gets dark, you're looking into darker areas, whatever, the human Mark I eyeball begins having issues collimating the two separate images of your primary and off eye, leading to the degradation or complete collapse of both eye open style shooting. And you're going to start seeing double. This isn't some bullshit hypothetical thing that YouTubers say. For example, in this footage right here, I'm trying to shoot at a easy to shoot target at about 50 yards from me, and I can't see it, or I'm struggling to see it, and I'm closing one eye, opening one eye. It's not a good time, right? And this is where LPVOs really make or break themselves, in my opinion. Most primary arms LPVOs have been pushing to go below 20 ounces. The SLx succeeds at this at 19 ounces, but the GLX is right around 23 ounces. Not catastrophic by any means, but certainly on the upper end of LPVOs. The GLX is also comically long. Probably the longest LPVO I've ever seen. Not something that really matters unless you've decided to dedicate the last 6 months of your life to reviewing bullpups, but with all that, what are we left with? Throughout this review, I was on track in the closer range sections to say the SLx had reclaimed the throne as a decent bang for buck option. It quickly became apparent that while SFP works really well for 6x LPVOs, the concept completely implodes for 8x and for sure 10x LPVOs that specifically use holds exclusively. Because the SLx is the even worse GPR style scope due to a mediocre 1x, I don't really know what niche the 1 to 10x SLx actually fits in. It's not terrible by any means, it just has an odd combination of features that don't play well together. So how's the GLX? Is it a low quality, cheaper PLXC? I think I mostly gave away the plot. No, the PLXC is a significantly different optic. And comparing the GLX, or really any 1 to 10x LPVO, to a PLXC style LPVO is going to result in disappointment. This class of optic is heavier, bigger, and by comparison has a pretty weak 1x. However, if you're on the LPVO train for magnified performance primarily, perhaps you're a godless heathen that buys LPVOs and then just uses a piggyback red dot for 1x, or you have a scope oriented around being a long-range SPR style scope, where the 1x is viewed as a nice bonus instead of the focus of the design, well, I think you can do a lot worse than this scope, especially since it ticks the box of having decent glass, while the 1x, not great compared to other LPVOs, is actually about average for a 1 to 10x. And in fact, above average when we consider we can actually see the damn reticle against high contrast backgrounds compared to the size 1 font that we find in a lot of other 1 to 10x first focal plane LPVOs. The 24mm objective size and weight is going to leave a lot to be desired. We can ultimately tough it out, especially when we consider what the price tag is, which is actually very low for 1 to 10x LPVOs that are worth a fuck. So while I almost universally always recommend against 1 to 10x LPVOs, if you're dead set on having one and understand the massive trade-offs for getting it, I'll admit this works pretty well.
The bar really has been lowered. Sparking,
She's egging him on.
No, but you want to chop at them, don't you?
Oh, dang. Yeah.
Oh, Nova, you almost got humped.
Yeah, you tell him, Nova. Don't you let him do that. Yeah.